Hi, I'm Jessica Steinberg. Welcome to the Times of Israel Daily Briefing.
Your update on what's important in Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world. Hello and welcome to the Times of Israel Daily Briefing. It's October the 27th, 2021. I'm Raoul Wootliff and I'm joined today by senior analyst Chaviv Retigor and health correspondent Nathan Jeffay. Thanks for joining me, guys.
Hello.
Hey, Raoul.
Before we start, I just want to remind you all about Streetwise Hebrew, bite-sized Hebrew classes available to the Times of Israel community that we think you'll love. More about that at the end of the show. On today's show, we'll assess the decision of FDA advisors to back administering the Pfizer vaccine to US children aged 5 to 11, paving the way for Israel to follow. We'll look at where Israel currently stands in its fight with the virus and ask what it needs to do now to ensure the fading Delta variant or other variants don't return. With the deadline for the government to pass a budget just 2.5 weeks away, the coalition appears to be preoccupied with infighting. We'll look at the battles between the left and right-wing parties and try to predict what might happen after the budget is possibly passed. We'll also take a look across the aisle at the opposition and their latest struggles. And finally, we'll get the latest on the Netanyahu corruption trial and assess the damage it could cause to the former Prime Minister. So Nathan, starting with you, what exactly did the US Food Administration advisory panel decide on yesterday and how could it impact Israel?
Yes, so what happened yesterday was that an advisory panel of the Food and Drug Administration in the United States voted that the vaccine's benefits in preventing COVID-19 among 5 to 11-year-olds, that giving the vaccine to prevent COVID seems to outweigh any of the risks of doing so. So this is kind of a major encouragement for the idea of giving vaccines to young children. We must stress that this does not mean that the FDA has yet approved vaccines for children. This was an advisory panel that is expected to happen over the coming days. So in the next few days, we do expect to have the FDA actually giving its full approval to COVID vaccines for children. I should also stress that it's not being suggested that children have a full adult dose of the COVID vaccine. Rather, it will be a smaller dose that is suitable for children. Now, all of that's happening in America. And in terms of kind of protocol, that doesn't actually have any direct impact on Israel. Israel is not bound by what the FDA does. The FDA is seen as kind of a gold standard internationally, but Israel is not bound by the FDA. However, Israel does often look to the FDA and in many cases will follow the FDA. And that's what's expected to happen here. It's expected that in this situation, Israel will follow the FDA's lead.
And when would that be likely to happen? We know that Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has called a meeting already today of senior health advisors to discuss giving the vaccine to 5 to 11-year-olds. When could we see children actually getting shots in Israel?
So the health ministry is talking about mid-November. I would expect realistically that it will be kind of towards the end of November. I think it's quite realistic that by the end of November, we will have children getting shots. As I've written, I don't expect that, or experts also don't expect that, to mean that there's kind of this huge deluge of parents taking their children for shots. I think it's going to happen, with a certain caution. There's going to be lots of parents who are going to want to wait for other kids to take the shots first, to kind of be that little bit cautious about it. So we're not going to see people everyone rushing to the vaccination centres, but we do expect some kids to start getting vaccinated, certainly during the course of November.
Nathan, I have 2 kids in that range, 7 and a 10-year-old, and 2 younger. And my 10-year-old is thrilled, eager, just excited to get the vaccine because we don't want to fly until the kids are vaccinated. And they want to already visit America and their grandparents and their cousins and whatnot. Can you walk me as a parent a little bit through what has had to happen for this to be safe?
So the main data that the FDA has been looking at, or the key data, is a clinical trial from Pfizer, which has made the vaccines that Israel is using. And this was a clinical trial which was very similar to the adult trial and also very similar to the trial for the 12 to 16 age group. And it involved 2,000 children, which is a relatively relatively good sample size. Obviously nothing compared to what we see in the real world when we start vaccinating. But among those 2,000 children, we saw 91% effectiveness against symptomatic infection. To emphasize, that does not mean that 1 in 10 people were getting COVID. It doesn't mean anything like that. It means that when you compare these children with a control group, it's giving them 91% protection against COVID infection. So we see that the effectiveness of the vaccine is really pretty good. And we also see that the safety profile is the main thing that they're looking at. If there were any kind of, major adverse reactions, major significant side effects that we need to be really worried about, they would have hopefully been flagged up in this 2,000 children study, and that's why these trials are so important. So basically, the FDA is looking at this data from this trial. That's kind of the main thing that they have to hand.
Now, Nathan, you wrote this week about the challenges that Israel still faces in vaccinating the rest of the population that's so far not got the shots. Can you walk us through some of what Israel has to do to prevent repeating past mistakes?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting issue because I think what happened at the end of the third wave was that Israel kind of got laid back, calmed itself down a bit, and really, I think, dropped the ball a little bit on vaccination. And, this isn't just my opinion. This is something that was actually said to me when I interviewed the coronavirus czar, Israel's coronavirus chief. He said this to me. At that point, we kind of dropped the ball on vaccination. And so the way that we've got through this fourth wave has been with really significant vaccination. So what we've done is we've given these booster shots, which have had really quite a good take-up. And what we've also managed to do is to vaccinate many of those people who didn't have vaccinations. Many of those who had been resisting vaccinations accepted vaccinations during the most recent wave. So we started the fourth wave with 1.4 million people completely unvaccinated, and now we have about 650,000 people. And some of the questions that face Israel now is how to actually interpret that data. Because if you think about it, you say, okay, we should be patting ourselves on the back and saying Israel's done really well here. That's great. We vaccinated more than half of those people who were resisting vaccination. On the other hand, you can ask the question and say, how can it be that we manage with relative ease to convince more than half of those people who've been resisting vaccinations and actually get them to a point where they took the vaccinations? Were we just not trying hard enough beforehand? Did we just not make enough efforts at the end of the third wave to increase the vaccination level? So the questions going on in health circles now are, should we say, hey, we've done really well? Or should we actually be using this to set ourselves a challenge and say, hey, in the past we've really underestimated how much we can push vaccination. We really need to push hard now, even though things are calming down here in Israel.
This Times of Israel podcast is brought to you by Koren Publishers Jerusalem. Whether you're looking to enrich your mind or your soul, Koren Publishers has it all. From Israeli history to the works of Rabbi Sachs, Rabbi Steinsaltz, and other contemporary thinkers, including the brand new Magaman edition Koren Tanakh, with translation by Rabbi Sachs, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Weinreb, Jessica Sachs, and many others. Times of Israel listeners can get 10% off your entire order. Just go to korenpub.com and use the code TOIPOD, that's KORENPUB.com, and enter the code TOIPOD for your 10% discount. Okay, so Chaviv, turning to you, with less than 3 weeks remaining until the government has to pass the state budget, a series of seemingly contentious issues and various ministerial decisions are pitting cabinet members from the left and right of the coalition against each other. Do you think the government will get to that November 14th deadline to pass a budget, or are these issues going to cause some serious problems?
Yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is I'm not sure. I suspect that we're getting to the mid-November deadline for the budget with a budget. And one of the reasons I suspect that is that the coalition is handling itself very well in terms of planning the budget. For example, the final budget vote is scheduled for 2 weeks before the deadline, at which point the coalition falls and we go to new elections. If they fail to pass. In other words, they've given themselves a 2-week window in which the budget law can fail, and then they can regroup, and then they can try again. And so I do think they're going to pass. There's so much in there for every single part of the coalition, for Labour, for Meretz, for Ra'am, certainly for the right, there's so much in that budget, and it really is the main achievement of this government. An achievement we should remember that Likud has failed to put on the table. They failed to pass a state budget. The last one was passed in March 2018. So I think they all have to pass the budget. And what we're seeing with these fights, and just to sort of describe the fights a little bit, Meretz and Labor are suddenly very anxious about some steps taken to label some Palestinian groups terror organizations, or the government's approval of 1,300 homes and settlements. Just things that are very right-wing steps by this government, which includes about a third of it or half of it right-wing parties. And suddenly the left is very upset. There's a lot of tension with Ra'am over a few things. There's a lot of tension between the different parties. I suspect what we're seeing is the certainty, the absolute conviction by these politicians that the budget is passing. Everybody has too much at stake. But what we're seeing is the beginning of the post-budget fights. They're laying the groundwork for the post-budget situation when the government, in theory, has 2 years before it has to pass the next budget. In theory, this should be a period of stability. But then the political parties' overriding interest is no longer cooperating to pass a budget, but maybe, I want to suggest, preparing for the possibility that this very strange government might actually collapse, from its own internal weight. And so showing their own base that they fought and they were standing up for their right constituencies and ideals. If these political parties, if Yamina needs to try and rehabilitate itself on the right, and New Hope needs to try and push itself in polls back above the voter threshold by reaffirming its right-wing credentials, and Meretz and Labor need to show that they're left-wing, and Ra'am needs to, weaken the other Arab parties, the Joint List's argument that they are colluding with the Israeli right in the occupation, and they all suddenly begin to posture and step away from each other and pick these fights, the coalition might collapse of its own accord. So I suspect that we're going to have a clear sailing, a little bit of rhetoric, but basically clear sailing to the budget. But watch this space, watch this rhetoric. It will tell us a lot about whether this government can survive in a post-budget world.
Now, as I said, on the other side of the aisle, the opposition this week largely dropped its boycott of the Knesset committees after the High Court of Justice refused to intervene. Tell me what this move by the opposition means.
Well, it's interesting. Why did the opposition boycott the Knesset committees? It argued that the coalition itself is invalid, is fraudulent. And those are words used by Netanyahu, that Naftali Bennett promised not to sit in a government with Yair Lapid in the campaign and then sat in a government with Yair Lapid. Now, how shall I put this? It's a little rich for Likud to argue that its opponents are invalid because they violated campaign promises. I am unfamiliar with an Israeli political party that did not violate campaign promises, but there is this sense that there's something, the opposition has argued that this coalition is fraudulent, this coalition is doomed to failure, it's doomed to collapse. And so it has refused to recognize or to even negotiate with the coalition over, in any serious way, over the distribution of seats in the Knesset committees and things like that. Where does that leave the opposition? They have sat out, essentially, the entire building of this first state budget in 3 years. They have sat out massive distribution of enormous billions and hundreds of billions in resources. And they have done it because it's Netanyahu's strategy to try and delegitimize the Bennett-Lapid government. And the main people hurt by this strategy, this Netanyahu strategy, are the Haredim, the ultra-Orthodox parties. And the ultra-Orthodox parties, because they were not in these committees, couldn't negotiate, couldn't offer their votes to get a little more funding to their yeshivas, and lost. Not only did they lose power because they followed Netanyahu into the opposition, they followed Netanyahu into 3 to 4 months of literally not negotiating for resources for their community in this massive budget, the first in years, and the last for 2 more years. And so we saw over the last few days actual rebellion against the Likud. And I think Likud itself understands that this rebellion is happening, is unstoppable. The coalition Netanyahu has built around himself was too hurt, especially the ultra-Orthodox, has simply been too hurt by this strategy for it to continue. And so we're going to see them in committees. We're going to see them fighting tooth and nail. There's still a week or 2 maybe for budget negotiations. The coalition itself is eager to get them on board because in exchange for some money, they will vote for the budget and allow the coalition to have to pay less to other parties in the coalition, or at least to ensure the budget passes, even if one or two MKs don't like it. It makes sure the budget passes, and it's a sign just of the scale, I think, of Netanyahu's failure over the last 2 years.
So finally, we'll turn to something that I've written about. Chaviv, do you want to switch roles maybe and ask me a question?
Yes, I actually was very curious about this. I am ashamed to say I haven't been following the Netanyahu trial nearly as closely as I should. And it felt as though yesterday there was an important pivot and we should pay more attention. Is that right? Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, exactly. So the criminal trial of former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been going on for 5 months now. And we've seen up until now the prosecution focus on the benefits that Netanyahu is said to have received. So we're talking about favorable coverage, primarily from the Walla news site, which is owned by the same owner who owns Bezek. Up until now, we've spoken about what Netanyahu has received. So I guess the quid in this alleged quid pro quo. Yesterday, we turned to the quo. What Netanyahu is alleged to have done as prime minister, to effectively have abused his position as prime minister, to give benefits to the Bezek telecommunications company in return for these favors. So there was a pivot, and the prosecution, instead of focusing only on what Netanyahu received, which in some ways is a little bit abstract. We're not talking about money under the table. We're talking about beneficial or promotional news coverage. On the other hand, when we talk about the role that the prime minister played in benefiting Bezek's shareholders, that's something that has a very different sound to it, at least among the public.
No, so in other words, Raoul, if I understand, it is, as you say, a pivot from looking into what feels, as you say, like a relationship between a politician and reporters, an unpleasant relationship, a dirty relationship. There was a lot of back and forth. There was a lot of changing of their coverage. It really is an unpleasant thing to discover, especially for a journalist. If it wasn't criminally corrupt, it certainly was dirty and inappropriate and unethical. But it's still a pivot from that to something that is even much, much more public question, which is, how did the communication ministry function in this relationship? And that, I think, the people need to know, want to know. There, the criminal questions might arise, might not, but that's really the public interest part of the trial, I think, right? Much more so than just finding out that there's some vaguely unethical journalists out there.
Exactly. And up until now, the 3 people that have testified have all been former or current employees of Walla. We had the CEO, Ilan Yeshua, and 2 editors from Walla who all testified to say that Walla, yes, gave very positive coverage to Netanyahu, often on his almost direct order. Yesterday, we had the testimony of Avi Berger, the former Director General of the Communications Ministry, and he started to tell the story being built by the prosecution of how Netanyahu pushed him and pushed the communications ministry to change its positions towards Bezek, to change some of the reforms that it was pushing in a way that would have benefited Bezek. And Avi Berger made a direct claim that Netanyahu's office pushed him to change a formal opinion in a way that would certainly have benefited Shaul Elovitch, the CEO of Bezek, who himself had threatened Avi Berger with losing his job if he didn't do this. So we're going to see the continuation of this stage of the trial for the next few days with Avi Berger testifying. And after that, the prosecution will put together these 2 sides to paint their accusation of criminality.
Okay.
So that's, I think, all we've got time for on today's daily briefing. I'd like to remind you again about Streetwise Hebrew, bite-sized Hebrew lessons available to the Times of Israel community. To access Streetwise Hebrew, join the community by signing up on the Times of Israel website. Jessica Steinberg will be back tomorrow on the daily briefing with more of what's important in Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world. I'd like to thank our guests Chaviv Rettig-Gur and Nathan Jeffe, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Hi, it's Sarah Tuttle Singer from the Times of Israel. Come join our community and support fast and fair independent journalism. You can sign up with the link at the bottom of every single article on the site.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel Daily Briefing.
You can find us daily wherever you get your podcasts.
And of course, on thetimesofisrael.com.